Hello friends. Now our body, the human body, is unique, it's exceptional because it can seem to work under various aspects of disease states, under stress. We can cope with a lot of things. We can cope with starvation, of course, to an extent. We could cope with fasting. We could cope with doing a lot of exercise, and our body adjust to our needs and requirements. And one time of particular adjustment that a woman goes through as far as the metabolism is concerned is exceptionally seen when pregnant woman carries her baby. I mean, the baby is exclusively dependent entirely for all its requirements on the mother, and our body meets that requirement of two beings from one place. So it's very, very important to overview our body's metabolism, keeping in mind that when you talk about metabolism, yes, you can talk about metabolism of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins and everything separately, but in a single person, under a single point in time, everything in our body works together. And it is good to appreciate, it is important to appreciate how our body's metabolism functions when considered in totality, and particularly focusing on a very, very important hormone, that is insulin. All right. Now, moving on forward, let's have a look at this. I mean, we have our fuel of energy, all our metabolic processes in our body, everything that we do. I mean, me speaking to you, me picking up the pen and writing on the board, every action requires energy in the form of ATP, energy generation, right? And for that, the fuel that is required, primarily fuel for our all needs, is glucose. This is our primary fuel. And this glucose can be broken down in glycolysis, and then further products of glycolysis could enter the Krebs cycle, and then energy and carbon dioxide is produced. Well, fats are another very, very important fuel for energy, and fats are typically used for energy generation when the glucose reserves are done, right? So yes, fats are a second most important source of energy generation, and the free fatty acids, the fats will be broken down to free fatty acids by a process called as lipolysis, and then these fatty acids can be used for energy generation. Similarly, amino acids, yes, amino acids we all know are the building blocks of our muscles. They are used for our proteins in our muscles, right? So they are building blocks. But amino acids also can be a source of energy by getting converted into glucogenic amino acids, right? So certain glucogenic amino acids can take part to give rise to intermediates in the glucose metabolic pathway, and then from there they can be used for energy generation, right? So you can have gluconeogenesis that happens from these glucogenic amino acids, and then it can be used for energy production. Now, whatever excess of fuels we have in our body, okay, in the normal state, when we are eating, when we are healthy and we are all doing fine, excess of fuel is stored in our body, and that's very important. I mean, how healthy we are is determined by how healthy our stores of fuel and reserves are. I mean, that is what is going to let us survive through periods of stress, illness, maybe pregnancy, and even periods of starvation, right? Now, moving on further, whatever we incorporate in our diet is in the form of the complex carbohydrates. You have proteins and you have fats, right? So our dietary intake entails the taking complex substances which are broken down into smaller particles. So we have digestion, right? We digest them. Digestion takes place in our gut, and then absorption of these smaller particles happens from our gut, and then of course transport to the various tissues where it is required, right? Now, carbohydrates can be broken down into glucose, yes, and your proteins are broken down into amino acids, and your fats are broken down into fatty acids and glycerol. And all of these compounds eventually, for energy generation, will need to be converted to acetyl coenzyme A. I mean, you can read about the independent pathways in your biochemistry textbooks, but the bottom line is that each of these compounds can be used for energy generation, because acetyl coenzyme A can enter the citric acid cycle and tricarboxylic acid cycle and generate ATP and carbon dioxide, right? So the various tissues can get all these metabolic fuels and then energy will be generated, right? Now, important thing to note are these storage tissues. Let's go ahead and have a look at them. Our storage of fuel is mainly occurring in liver, right? The skeletal and the cardiac muscle and the adipose tissue. That is the fat cells of our body, right? Now look here. Glucose from the circulation will enter the liver. Amino acids from the circulation will enter the liver. Similarly, amino acids and glucose will enter the skeletal and cardiac muscle. And glucose and free fatty acids will enter the adipose tissue. These are our storage sites. And the action of moving these fuels inside these tissues is mediated by insulin. This is insulin mediated uptake of these nutrients, glucose, amino acids moving into the liver. Now in the liver, you can see here, glucose can get phosphated. If there is excess of glucose, it can be stored in the form of glycogen, right? If there is any time, glucose is required by the body and a person is not eating, then glucose can be broken down here, glycolysis, and then blood glucose levels can rise, right? And similarly, our skeletal and cardiac muscles, I mean, these are also sites where these are our protein stores of our body. Significant glycogen stores are also present in the skeletal and cardiac muscles, right? Glycogen stores are primarily present in the liver. Some protein stores are also present in the liver as well, right? And moving on here, our adipose tissue is the site of our fat stores. Now, fats are nothing but, I told you, they are triglycerides. Ultimately, they are esters of free fatty acids combined with glycerol. And that is what our free fat stores are going to comprise of, triglycerides. We call them as lipid stores, right? So yes. Now, moving on, if you realize here that the storage fuel is generated by the use of the hormone that is insulin. So, insulin in our body has a very, very important function. It is our hormone of plenty, right? When we are eating, when we are surviving, when we are doing well, and we are building up the energy stores in our body in the form of protein and glycogen stores and fat stores, it's all insulin. So insulin causes the movement of building blocks into the cells, right? Cells of liver, skeletal, cardiac muscle, and adipose tissue. Now, the primary stimulus for insulin, I mean, we can only build our stores when we eat. When we don't eat, we don't build those stores, right? So the primary stimulus for insulin release by our body is feeding. Feeding is the stimulus, eating is the stimulus. And pancreas, this endocrine organ here, pancreas, the beta cells of the pancreas, they are the ones that secrete insulin. Insulin is the hormone. Now, hormones, see, they're secreted from here, from the pancreas, but endocrine hormones, how do they act? They will be carried by bloodstream to distant sites and exert its action on sites like liver, skeletal, cardiac muscle, adipose tissue. So, mainly responsible for storage of fuel in our body. So, insulin is a bodybuilding hormone. It's an anabolic hormone. And yes, of course, consider this as well, that in our body, you see, I mean, my brain, I want my brain to function even if I'm not eating. I want my RBCs to function and carry oxygen for me even if I'm not eating. I mean, if I were a pregnant woman, then I would want my baby or my fetus to get all the glucose, all the nutrition that he needs without bothering about me eating or not eating, right? So there are certain tissues in the body where the movement of glucose and the movement of nutrients into the cells is not dependent on insulin, and thankfully so, like our brain, RBCs, kidney, colon, and the placenta as well in a pregnant woman. So yes, there are certain insulin independent sites of action as well. Now, moving on further, I want to talk about the overview of fat metabolism in particular. Now, why I want to talk about it? Primarily because, see, glucose is the primary fuel. Okay. Now, when we are not eating, let's say we are fasting or during periods of starvation, first of all, the primary glycogen stores in the liver, they will be used up. I told you, right? From the glycogen in the liver, it can be broken down to release glucose to meet the energy requirements. And yes, of course, once those stores are also depleted, I will have to use up my fat stores, right? So now let's talk about the overview of fat metabolism to understand that logic here a bit. So when we say dietary lipids, again, they are all in the forms of esters of free fatty acids with glycerol. So they are triglycerides. Okay. So yes, these are dietary lipids, triglycerides, and they are broken down into the constituent free fatty acids and glycerol, and then they are absorbed, right? Now, when these lipids or free fatty acids or triglycerides, when they're absorbed, they are not soluble. Fats are not soluble in water, right? They are insoluble. So, of course, you see, to get transported, they need to become soluble, right? Now, how does it brought about? It is brought about by organizing these, absorbed triglycerides in the form of chylomicrons, right? So, chylomicrons is what we call as a type of lipoprotein, right? So, lipids, fats, triglycerides, for them to be transported in the bloodstream, they need to get converted into lipoprotein, right? So lipids themselves are insoluble, right? So you see here, these are the lipid chains on the inside and then outer covering of the protein. So these are lipoproteins. Now these chylomicrons, of course, they're entering the bloodstream after absorption from the gut. Okay, now have a look. Now appreciate here that once they are absorbed and these particles of chylomicrons, they are, traveling in the bloodstream here. If you look at the constituents of the chylomicrons, they're rich in triglycerides. Okay, they're rich in triglycerides. Okay, and the endothelial cells of the blood vessels, they contain these enzymes. The surface of the endothelial cells of the blood vessels, they contain this enzyme which we call as lipoprotein lipase. Lipoprotein lipase. Okay. Now, this lipoprotein lipase is going to, as the name said, lipase. It is going to break down the lipids, right? So, the triglycerides are broken down into glycerol and free fatty acids, right? Now, glycerol can enter the tricarboxylic acid pathway. Let's not go there. Let's focus on the free fatty acids. These free fatty acids, when the need arises, can be used for energy production, right? But yes, of course, when they are excess, that is when we are gorging on a fat-rich diet. So let's see. When they are in excess, they are going to get stored in fat stores, right? So these free fatty acids are going to move inside, right? The fat stores are also getting, so free fatty acids moving inside, right? Glucose moving inside, right? From glucose, one can get glycerol, and all those pathway can be considered in detail when you go through your biochemistry textbooks. The important point to note here is that free fatty acids are going to combine with glycerol again and give rise to triglycerides, forming up the major lipid stores or the fat stores in our body. When the need arises by our body, these same fat stores can be broken down into releasing free fatty acids back into the circulation again. And this is achieved by another enzyme, which is now hormone sensitive. Hormone sensitive lipoprotein lipase. Okay, so it is this hormone sensitive lipoprotein lipase which is responsible for breaking down lipids or fats or triglycerides in the fat stores, and from there releasing free fatty acids into circulation when the need arises by the body. That now, let's say somebody is starving and wants to use free fatty acids for energy resource, this would become active, right? Now let us just elaborate on it a little bit. Let us see here. When we are feeding, right? Feeding actually stimulates this lipoprotein lipase. Because when we are feeding, we want our stores of fats to build up. For fats to enter into the fat cells eventually, they will first have to get broken down. See, chylomicrons will first have to get broken down into free fatty acid and glycerol, and then free fatty acid will move into the fat stores, right? So when we are feeding, what happens? The lipoprotein lipase, which is present on the endothelial cell lining, that is stimulated. And when we are feeding, our body is also releasing insulin, remember? Right? Now, feeding and insulin inhibits this hormone sensitive lipoprotein lipase. Because when we are feeding, insulin is released, then we want storage of fats to happen, right? So for storage of fats to happen, one has to see that the hormone sensitive lipoprotein lipase is inhibited by feeding and insulin. So what happens when we are fasting, when we are not eating, or during periods of starvation? You see, when we are fasting, or when there is insulin deficiency in our body, the opposite will happen. The hormone sensitive lipase, this is going to get stimulated. And when that is going to happen, you see, the fat stores will be broken down and there will be re-entry of free fatty acids into the circulation. And then these free fatty acids can be used for energy production. Now, that is our body's adjustment to periods of fasting and starvation and insulin deficiency, right? Now, moving on further, let's just also focus on the use of free fatty acids as a fuel for energy. Well, yes, free fatty acids can get converted to acetyl coenzyme, release energy. That's fine. But what happens when the body, during states like prolonged starvation, is producing more and more free fatty acids, right? So when free fatty acids are in excess, they are going to enter the liver, and here in the liver, these free fatty acids will be converted to ketone bodies, a process which is called as ketogenesis, right? Now, these acetoacetate, beta-hydroxybutyrate, acetone, these are the ketone bodies, right? Now, the enzymes for ketogenesis are only present in the liver. So, liver is our only site for ketogenesis, okay? Now, free fatty acids, you see, are very essential fluids. Why? And a very good source of fuel or energy for our brain and cardiac muscle, right? They are very adept and efficient in using free fatty acids for energy production. But if you take a look at the RBCs, the red blood cells, they can only use glucose for their energy requirements. Now, coming back to this situation here. Now, when there is excess of free fatty acids, so much so that a lot of ketogenesis is happening. You see, ketone bodies by themselves can also be used for energy production in the liver. But when they are excess, they are going to spill into the bloodstream. And what is the problem with ketone bodies in the bloodstream? What is the problem? These ketone bodies are acidic in nature. a situation we call as ketosis, which is acidosis. Ketone bodies will be eliminated in the urine, ketonuria. So periods of starvation, excessive illness which leads to excessive vomiting, so much so that the person is unable to eat, ketosis, acidosis, ketoacidosis, which we call it, right? Okay, insulin deficiency, isn't it? Insulin deficiency again can lead to this diabetic ketoacidosis. We know of it, diabetic ketoacidosis. So this is what happens when there is prolonged starvation or severe insulin deficiency, right? And acetone, on the other hand, is gaseous. It can be eliminated in the breath. So it leads to that characteristic ketone breath, right? Bad breath, ketone breath. So yes, this is an important aspect to understand. Now, what I want you to gain from this video is how the metabolism works in totality and how that is reflected during periods of stress, starvation, fasting and everything. So if you remember this basic overview, these things are going to be much easier to remember and follow. Now, let's say, for example, if I were to ask you to summarize the actions of insulin, insulin being such an important hormone, insulin being so important because nowadays with the increasing incidence of diabetes, you see, all of us are wanting to talk about insulin, and moreover, you have to, when you read diabetes in detail, you have to talk about how insulin is used for the treatment, what is wrong in diabetes, how does the body's metabolism affected. To be able to answer that question, you should be knowing first the actions of insulin, isn't it? So if you summarize here in this chart, and now that you know all the processes involved, right, and you know all the basic overview, insulin is causing movement of the fuels inside the tissues of storage, right? So yes, insulin is increasing glycogen synthesis in the liver. Insulin is increasing protein synthesis in the liver. Insulin is increasing lipid synthesis in the liver. It is increasing all of these in the skeletal muscles as well and the cardiac muscles as well. But yes, the primary synthesis that is taking place in the muscle is protein synthesis. Keep that in mind also. If you talk about what is happening in the adipose tissue, insulin is causing increase in lipid synthesis in the adipose tissue, right? Now, if you look at the other thing, what happens to the breakdown of fatty acids? Breakdown of fatty acids, insulin is an anabolic hormone. It is building up storages, right? So all the catabolic actions will be inhibited, isn't it? So insulin decreases the breakdown of fatty acids, right? It is insulin deficiency which is causing the breakdown of fatty acids. Insulin is decreasing ketogenesis. Insulin is decreasing gluconeogenesis. Insulin is decreasing protein breakdown. Insulin is decreasing the production of glucogenic amino acids. And insulin is decreasing lipolysis in the adipose tissue by, inhibiting hormone sensitive lipoprotein lipase. So we've talked about this, and now let us also understand one thing. What will happen when there is insulin deficiency? What will happen when there is insulin deficiency? Or what will happen when there is insulin but it is not able to act? Insulin resistance. This is what happens in diabetes mellitus, right? So broadly, when we say diabetes, what does that mean? Diabetes is a condition where insulin is not able to act on the tissues, right? So there is tissue inaction of insulin. There is no tissue response. Why? Because of two things. It could be insulin deficiency, which we talk about when there is a type 1 insulin diabetes mellitus, which is insulin dependent diabetes mellitus, right? That happens because of insulin deficiency. Or there could be that the insulin is present but is not able to act on the tissues where it is supposed to act because of insulin resistance. Both of the conditions leading to diabetes mellitus, right? And if you have a look at it, yes, when there is diabetes mellitus which goes on unchecked, untreated over a period of time, what is going to happen? What is going to happen? The stores will all be broken down because the fuel that is glucose is not able to enter these storage sites. No. So all these fuels will be broken down. The catabolic reactions will be triggered, protein breakdown will happen, so the person actually loses weight. With untreated diabetes, the person eventually actually loses weight, loses the protein stores of the body, becomes cachexic, loses the fat stores of the body. Severe insulin deficiency could trigger what we say diabetic ketoacidosis here. So ketogenesis will be triggered in cases of insulin deficiency or insulin inaction, right? And glucose is not entering the storage sites, you see. So where is this glucose going? This is spilling over into the bloodstream. It is spilling over into the bloodstream. So a person is eating and eating, right? But the tissues are not building up stores, right? It is spilling into the blood, right? And there is this intense desire to eat also. There's polyphagia, right? There's polydipsia. You drink more water. It's like starvation in the midst of plenty. That is how diabetes is classically described. Your tissues are starving, even though there is rampant amount of glucose spilling over into the bloodstream. I hope this message is clear, so that when later on you start reading about the pathology of diabetes, keep this chart of actions of insulin and the concept of overview of body metabolism in mind. It will help you answer a lot of pathological questions.